Airplane pilots have read it. What was your biggest we're all f***ed up moment that you survived and your passengers didn't notice? This was about 7 years ago now. I took my brother and 2 cousins up for a short sightseeing flight one morning in a Cessna 172. I knew there was some weather coming in, so I wanted to get it over with quickly. About 20 minutes in, I noticed the clouds getting worse and then some lightning off in the distance. Definitely time to head back. Heading back, I radioed my intentions. Uncontrolled airport, but with an FBO, and someone radioed back with the current winds. It didn't compute what they said, and in retrospect, I should have asked for clarification. Get back to the airport, and as I'm on final, I realize just how bad the wind is. Having a hard time keeping on center line and eventually go around on the first try. By now, I'm starting to sweating bullets and planning on rerouting if the next attempt doesn't go well. I make sure to turn the intercom off so my cousins in the back can't hear how panicked I'm becoming, though I did keep my cool through the whole thing. On second attempt, I've got the rudder pegged to the left and managed to get the wheels on the ground safely. I taxi to park, shut down, jump out, and start shaking with adrenaline, and let out a huge sigh of relief. Cousins had no idea what just happened. It was just an exciting flight to them. My brother kind of knew what was going on, and I let him in on what I was thinking later. Apparently, I had an audience of guys from the FBO watching me as well, probably yelling at me too, go somewhere else. I'm honestly surprised sometimes I managed that landing with no incidents, especially since that was basically my first crosswind landing. Commenter: man, crosswind landings are no joke. My dad had to make one in his 182 in either Utah or Nevada, and my mom and I were with him. I've never seen such nervousness and concentration mixed together before. I was only 12 or so at the time, and my dad had been flying for a long time, so he's had his fair share of scares. But he said this one was his biggest, because we were on board too. Made it safely after a retree. Needless to say, we stayed an extra night to let him calm down, and also to wait for the winds to die down. Story 2? Uncoordinated turn, and all the fuel went to one side of the plane. Choked both engines, sputtered and cut out. 3,000 feet high, so brought back the coordination and pointed down a bit. The started back up. Yikes. Edit. Well, this got some attention. Some clarifying points. #1, not an airline pilot. I'm an aerial photo pilot. Had one passenger, the camera operator, and he didn't notice, but to be fair, he was pretty into his podcast. #2. It was intentional to be uncoordinated. We use skidding turns to turn 180 degrees faster so we can get one line and collect more pictures. #3, it was a light twin. We were low-ish on fuel, and that's what enabled the airplane to be starved of fuel. Under normal circumstances, this would not have happened. Okay, clear skies. Adios. Story 3. Once, departing Burning Man in a private plane with a couple of passengers, my engine conked out. I didn't even follow the engine out checklist. I glanced at the fuel pressure gauge, didn't like what I saw, hit the switch for the auxiliary fuel pump, and it came back to life. The whole incident was over so fast the passengers never even noticed. I wouldn't call it a we're all ducked moment, though. Worst case scenario, I would have had to set it back down on the playa, which is pretty flat terrain as far as the eye can see. Story 4? I was in the process of getting my PPL, private pilot license, and I was flying circuits solo. Before I took off, the CFO of the flight school asked me if I was sure it was a good idea to fly. It's pretty windy. I was flying a Cessna 152 on a day with wind pushing 15 Ks and turbulence around 20. I honestly don't know what I or anyone at the flight school was thinking, letting me, 16 years old, take off. Anyways, a few bumpy circuits go by with no problem. I actually got some great practice landing in turbulence. So the last circuit of the day, I'm on final with full flaps doing the absolute minimum speed for approach in a 152, not taking into consideration that the air is super turbulent. For those who don't know, when it's bumpy, you should be going a little faster on approach than usual. Anyways, I'm quite close to the ground, maybe 300, 400 feet, and I can hear the wind blowing over the sound of the engine. Suddenly, no wind. I had just lost 15-20 kts of almost direct headwind on final approach with absolutely no airspeed to spare. I remember my shirt sleeves looked like they were inflating and the plane's stall warning started screaming at me. The controls became totally useless, like a limp computer joystick. Thankfully, I had my hand on the throttle like my instructor taught me, and for whatever instinctual reason, good instructor probably, I gently pushed the throttle all the way and slightly lowered the nose. All of this took place in the span of about 5 seconds. I remember what I did, but not thinking about doing it. It was like when you drive somewhere, and you suddenly realize you've arrived without remembering driving. Damn scary. Anyways, I landed the plane just fine and went home and took a nap. My parents said I was pale as a ghost when I got home. Flying is fun until it isn't. Edit 1. Thanks for gold. My first. Edit 2. A lot of people are wondering why I gently pushed the throttle in. The reason is because the carburetor can't provide enough fuel to maintain the proper fuel-air mixture. When the pilot rapidly pushes the throttle in, the carb is supposed to provide a quick squirt of fuel to account for the rapid increase in air. If the pilot asterisk slams the throttle to the firewall asterisk, the huge amount of air coming into the carb is simply too much for it to maintain the proper air-fuel mixture, even with the extra squirt. In the best case, this can cause the engine to lag for a few seconds, while the mixture catches up, and in the worst case, might actually cause the engine to stall completely. So imagine an inexperienced pilot who panics and really jams the throttle all the way. That may have a disastrous effect, because not only are they at low altitude with little airspeed, but they just choked their engine and simply can't get more power. Commenter. Similar story to you. I'm a relatively new student pilot, and I was just starting to practice pattern work by myself, but my instructor either wanted me to go up with him for a few laps before soloing or with another instructor if he had other students. So my instructor has another student he's teaching. I end up going up with another instructor just to verify that little 10 hours me can still fly a plane before I practice for an hour or two. We take off, and as I'm on final for our last practice run, it's a little shaky, as it is usually in the mid-afternoon in Florida, but I'm confident in my ability to land the plane. Well, to my surprise, when I'm about maybe 100 feet above the runway, the plane just drops in an instant, like someone took their hand and just pushed down. Luckily, my instructor must have trained me well because, like you, I had my hand on the throttle and just gently pushed the power to full, leveled the nose, and made a smooth go-around. Made me feel good knowing that my brain knew what to do without having to think about it much. Also, the instructor I was with, I always thought seemed to look a bit angry, but I was pleasantly surprised when he smiled and complimented me on my quick decision-making. Getting a compliment for doing something specifically well, other than like, good job today, boosted me as a new student. It wasn't necessarily a situation where I'm thinking, oh crap, we could have died, but knowing that I'm capable of recovering from a scenario as such and not ending up like the guy who slammed a plane onto the runway and broke the gear. I still hear about the landing gear incident guy, and it's been months. Story 5. This entire story occurred in less than 10 seconds and should have ended with headlines on CNN. Military pilot and not commercial. But it still could have ended in a disaster, flying an IH-47D Chinook helicopter in Iraq, mid-July 2008, when the temp was over 130 degrees, packed full with 36 passengers at an altitude of only 100 feet and speed of 140 knots, lower and faster than you'd ever fly in the US. We hit a thermal, pocket of warm air, that pushed us up, so I nosed the cyclic, looks like a joystick between your legs, forward to maintain altitude. I was a brand new pilot flying with a combat vet who wanted me to maintain altitude of 100 feet almost exactly, so no higher than 120 or lower than 80 feet. Nosing the aircraft down kept us from going higher. But we immediately hit a downdraft and the aircraft started to fall like a rock. I pulled back on the cyclic as hard as I could to get the nose up, but it hit my body armor and wouldn't go back any further. I watched the altimeter drop all the way to 19 feet, and miraculously, we started falling and began to climb at the last possible second. During the debrief, the other pilot, now one of my closest friends, who had well over 1,000 combat hours, told me he's never been so close to dying before. I wasn't shook up until I heard that even typing this today gives me chills. Edit. Hopefully made it easier to understand. Edit. I'm lucky to get 20 fake internet points for my posts. I can't believe this blew up the way it did. Thanks for my first ever guiding. That's a really badass surprise. And I promise to get back to everyone who messaged and commented. Thank you again. Reddit is a great place sometimes. Story 6. Not completely on topic, but I was an aircraft mechanic for the Navy back in the day on A4 Skyhawks. Student pilot notices his canopy light is on, indicating his canopy isn't all the way closed and locked. He decided it might help if he cracked the canopy open just a little bit and close it again. I remember seeing it land as a convertible. We sent a couple of guys out in a pickup truck where they found the missing canopy in a farmer's field. Story 7. Mine is from many, many years ago when I was a student pilot. I was 14, I think, at the time. I had about 15-ish hours done and getting close to soloing for the first time, but still had a few hours and more landings to practice. I was doing some basics and getting ready to come back with my instructor to practice some touch and goes for a bit. Coming back through, we had to pass through DTW's Bravo airspace. Means need permission to go through it. A few min before I was about to call for permission, my instructor got really quiet. I looked over at him and he looked really bad. I thought he was going to puke, so looking for a bag. But then I notice he isn't breathing. I figure out where I am at and call up DDW approach. Declare a medical emergency and that my instructor was not breathing. I also told them I am a student and never landed on my own before, and never in a large airport. Detroit Approach was amazing at helping me. They gave me an option for DDW or Willow, but Willow would have added a good 5 to 10 minutes since I was coming in from the sea. Opted for DTW and they were great at giving me vectors while also getting the big jets out of the way. I remember hearing them tell several planes to go around and several more into a hold. Anyway, did my approach and made the most butter-smooth landing I have ever made in my life. Even till this day, Ambulance was right there on the taxi waiting for me. Turns out my instructor, who was only 25, had a heart attack. He ended up being okay. All in all, from first call to him in the ambulance was less than 10 minutes thanks to ATC and DTW Tower. Story 8. Not a pilot, but a passenger was on a 16-seater turboprop when suddenly there's a loud bang. All the lights go out, and we drop. We're all looking around like, what's going on? Is this how we die? After a few minutes, the lights come back on and the pilot comes in the PA. Says, sorry about that, folks. But we were just stuck by lightning. No need to worry. Everything seems to be working, except for the radar. It's fried. I may have worried a little. Commenter. Believe it or not, that actually happens pretty regularly. It's usually not a big deal. Planes are designed with that in mind. Story 9. 56% of pilots admit falling asleep during flight, whilst 29% admit they woke up to their co-pilot asleep too. I'm willing to bet those are just the pilots who were honest about it, and the number is much higher. Added, that's kind of disconcerting. But realistically, that shouldn't scare you very much. The plane is flying itself. The pilots are just monitoring. And if anything changes, alarms are going to go off like crazy, which would probably wake up a pilot. Now, if they didn't wake up to an alert, that would be terrifying. An ATC controller falling asleep could cause much more damage. There was a crash caused by a pilot waking up. As he woke, he saw a bright light dead ahead and, still half asleep, assumed it was another plane coming at him. He quickly put the plane into a dive to avoid it and ended up crashing the plane. The bright light was Venus, which was very bright in the pre-dawn morning. Story 10. Was learning to fly when I worked for the Gov. So on my first flight with me taking off, we've been climbing for about 5 minutes, and we're going through some gentle turns when instructor says, we're going to head back, I don't feel well. He takes over the stick and he looks ashen. He then starts to breathe erratically and says, I need to help him control the plane. He radios tower and up till now I'm thinking it's a prank. Mayday, mayday. He talks me through the whole thing. I'm trying to talk to the tower, repeat info, read gauges, remember lessons, listen to him, and hope he don't pass out. I was crapting myself. Takeoff is one thing, but landing? We land like a kangaroo with a rocket up its ass. I'm surprised the wheels didn't fold. Must have been 4 big bounces, but it's a big runway. Scrub speed. Finally get the plane to stop and instructor passes out. He had a heart attack. He survived, but only for a few months before I heard he passed away in his sleep. But he got us down. I never continued the lessons. Story 11. I'm a CFI at this point, and I'm flying with a student. We see a spider in the banana pit. I'm okay with spiders, but I don't want it distracting the student, so I mash it. Student missed the spider, but saw my movement and asked what it was. I responded, it was a spider. I killed it, as I'm glancing into the back seat area. I managed to casually add, why? Are you scared of spiders? Without the student noticing the break in the sentence. Turns out the student is scared of spiders. For the rest of that flight, I squished spiders behind my student's back as they came forward from the nest I had just spotted in the back of the plane. He never knew. Story 12. Not a pilot, but my buddy has a private license, and we fly together often, just for his hours. I buy lunch, he gets hours, it's fun. I live in the PNW and wanted to fly over Crater Lake one winter. Ceiling 8,000 feet, Crater Lake 6,000 feet. He doesn't have his instrumental yet, so we can't break ceiling. We fly over, have an easy time, take great pics, etc. We get back to the airport, go to the bar, and he proceeded to tell me that was the most frightened he's ever been piloting. Why? The single-engine Cessna we were in could glide 2-3 miles in an emergency. Crater Lake is 8+ miles in diameter. In the middle, we'd be ducked. I asked him what he would do. He said, I'd nosedive into the water. You want to swim in that crap and drown? Or die quick and mostly painless? FML edit. Sorry guys, freezing temps, ice and snow everywhere. Pics on my profile. Story 13. There's never been a moment like this for me because you're always trying something else to save the plane. There's never been a real situation where I had to save a plane from imminent disaster. There's decisions I've had to make that if I chose wrong, we can be in a bad spot, but never anything like we're all going to die. Once, when landing a RJ on a short runway out in the Northeast, I was carrying a little bit too much speed and caught a gust at the wrong moment in the landing flare. The plane lifted maybe 10 higher, and I slowly lowered the nose. I realized at this moment that where the plane will touch down will not give me a whole lot of opportunity to stop before the end of the runway. As a matter of fact, it's probably not going to stop until we get into the trees at the end. I pushed the power up, and we did a go-around maybe 30 feet off the ground. The controllers vectored us around, and we landed safely on Tri-2. In the simulator, we do all the oh crap stuff, and even when a training event goes sideways, we still try to fly the thing until it hits something solid. I can't imagine ever giving up on the plane in flight. There's thousands of decisions made every day on flights by pilots that prevent a difficult situation from becoming dangerous. Flying these days is very cautious and conservative. Safety is always first, and nothing is allowed to ever slide. Story 14. My friend's girlfriend is a flight attendant, and they had one trip where they ran out of alcohol. They were worried people would get mad or freak out because some people heavily rely on alcohol to help with the nerves of flying, but none of the passengers noticed because after they served the last drink, nobody ordered anything else. It's not a crazy life or death scenario, but I thought it was an amusing anecdote about the passengers not realizing something. Commenter: had a period of about 4 years when I had an extreme phobia of flying that appeared suddenly, then vanished just as suddenly between flights. Needed to take a plane to visit my girlfriend at one point, and I was not doing so hot. Think the flight attendant must have thought I was cute or pathetic or something, because that beautiful git gave my 21-year-old self enough cheap free drinks to survive the flight. This is it, I'm about to die, breaking my brain every second for a few hours straight. The only thing between me and a massive panic attack was a bit flimsy plastic cup, dispensed by a dude who could have just politely offered me full-price drinks, then kept walking. Basically, I probably owe my entire heckin' marriage, at least a tiny bit, to a really nice flight attendant who did a superb job while the pilot took a nap. Wish I could thank him. Story 15. Not quite with passengers, but Taifu nonetheless. During my first solo flight ever, I was really excited and wanted to video record the special occasion. So there I was, taxiing down the taxiway with one hand holding my phone. One thing about old propeller planes is that they're just like old cars and don't always drive straight. I suppose I was a little too concentrated on making sure my camera was properly angled and focused. Next thing I knew, my plane ended up rolling off the asphalt. Into the ducking grassy ditch, I panicked. How TF am I supposed to get this plane out of here over the radio? There was a silence as the controller likely saw what happened from the tower. After a few seconds, probably still speechless at this point, she casually checked on me to make sure I was doing okay to save my embarrassment. I tried to power up and drive out of the grass back to the asphalt. Much to my surprise, it worked. I did my short flying as planned and returned to the hangar where my instructor was waiting. I have no idea how many people saw what happened, but from the look on his face, I'm pretty sure he knew too. And yes, that video of me driving a plane into a ditch still exists somewhere. I suppose this is the airplane equivalent of don't text and drive. Story 16. Long time ago, back in 1989, I was a first officer on the 747-100. We pushed back from the terminal in Anchorage and taxied out for a departure to Narita, Tokyo. We were full of people and very close to max takeoff weight. At the end of the runway, it was my takeoff. I stood on the brakes, stood the thrust levers up, and the engineer set full takeoff power. Released the brakes, and off we trundled. And we rolled and rolled and rolled down the runway. It was not sparkling acceleration by any means. As the end of the runway loomed into sight and takeoff speed still some distance away, with the lights going. Red, white, red, white, red, 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 the captain said, and I quote, "Best you rotate." We were a good 20 kts below VR. Not being a total numpty, I slowly and smoothly rotated, and the beast flew away off the end of the runway like a lady. We slowly climbed away, cleaned up, turned, and headed out west. Not a word was said for a long while. Finally, through 2,000 feet, the engineer launched himself at the my performance figures. Nothing was wrong, and we were at full power anyway. It turned out that extra cargo had been loaded in error, and we were well overweight. Apart from me wetting the seat and a raised heart rate, the passengers were none the wiser. Story 17. I'm a commercial helicopter pilot. Probably the closest moment to "we're ducked" I ever had was a few years ago. To set it up, I was ferrying a helicopter by myself to another location about 200 miles away. The helicopter I was flying was set up for IFR, instrument flying, and I'm a fairly experienced IFR captain. The helicopter I was in does not like ice. That means that flying in the clouds when it's below freezing is basically impossible. This was in the high Arctic, in the early spring, so basically always cold. Weather wasn't great, but I still wanted to give the trip a shot. If it was bad, I would just turn around and come home. About 50 miles out, the cloud ceiling was coming down, and visibility was dropping. I was over a small frozen lake, and I could see at the other end of the lake that the clouds were right to the ground. At this point, I'm at about 300 feet above ground. I make the call to turn around and start a left-hand turn, but as I'm halfway through the turn, I enter cloud. Under normal circumstances, a VFR helicopter unintentionally entering cloud is often a death sentence, but I'm a trained IFR pilot in an IFR helicopter. I start a climb as I know there is rising terrain on the side of the lake. I don't mind flying in cloud. What I do mind is the fact that my helicopter starts icing up instantly. I'm not talking about a bit of ice. I'm talking about a massive amount of ice in a helicopter that doesn't like any ice. There is no way I can make it the 50 miles back to the airport to shoot an IFR approach, and I know the clouds are too thick to climb above them. I also can't descend because the ceiling is so low that I risk impacting the terrain if I don't pop out of the clouds soon enough. I'm running through the options in my head, but my heart rate is going up. This isn't something that normally happens. I'm not the type of pilot that gets into situations that scare me. I'm rapidly running out of time, so I head to a larger flat area, as indicated on my GPS and maps. Set my radio altimeter, a device that tells you exactly how far above the ground you are, to beep at me when I reach 250 feet, and start descending. I figure if I don't break out by 300 feet, I'm in some serious trouble. As I'm approaching 300 feet, I break out of cloud. Good visibility, and a clear path all the way back to the airport. I do a normal approach and landing, and shut down at our hangar. The blades are covered in ice. After I change my underwear, we pull the helicopter into the hangar to let the ice thaw. The next day, the weather is beautiful, and the trip goes off without a hitch. After flying for 10 years and thousands of hours, it was the only time I was actually scared. I'm glad I didn't have any passengers on board at the time. Story 18. I wasn't the pilot, but I was a passenger on a glider. For those who don't know, gliders cannot get off the ground on their own. For this glider, we needed a tow plane, a 172. The 172 has a tow hook that they clip into our nose. When we want to release, we go through a release procedure. The pilot in the 172 dips a wing to signal the release. He slows down, we dive. This creates slack. We nose up, then release the tow cable. The Cessna flies on. Its merry way, and we glide. Well, during the release procedure, something went wrong and the cable could not be released. The glider pulled on the tail of the Cessna and caused a ton of chaos, as flying a 172 with a glider that isn't synced with your motions is incredibly hard. Luckily, we both made it back in one piece. But that could have very well caused the 172 to stall and crash, and we would be dragged down with them, watching helplessly. Story 19. When I was younger, I was with my dad, who pilots a small plane. We were mid-flight and the engine just started slowing down and the plane started descending crazy fast. It somehow picked up again before hitting the ground. Mind you, this happened in under a minute. I didn't panic or anything because I had no idea .EF was going on. I was like 3, 4, so I only realized in hindsight what actually happened. Story 20. I'm an airline pilot now, but my first job was flying banners. I have another good banner tow story, but I've told it before. I didn't have passengers, but I had viewers, and from their perspective, nobody noticed. One day, as usual, I was given the job of heading to a fairly distant location, unpacking and setting up my banner, and picking it up and flying it. Setup went like it usually does, and I took off to pick the banner up. In banner towing, the way it works is you've got a grappling hook at the end of a cable that's attached to the tail of the aircraft. You take off without the banner attached and come back around, swooping down steeply toward a loop of rope you have set up on the ground held up between 2 posts, running down to the banner. At the last second, you yank the plane back skyward, and the hook is supposed to swing between the posts and hook the rope. On my pickup, I felt the satisfying pull of the banner as I leveled off, but something was wrong. It was pulling hard to the left side. A quick look to my left showed that I had missed with the hook, and instead caught the banner rope loop with my left main wheel. Even worse, instead of sliding up the gear leg to the fuselage, the rope had caught down near the wheel. I had been provided a steak knife for the purpose of cutting the rope, but there was no way I was going to be able to reach that rope. The plane was yawing hard, but it was under control, and I flew slow circles around the airport while I thought about my options. I could always try to land the plane with the banner attached, but from what I'd heard, that usually results in the plane tipping over onto its nose, ruining the engine and propeller at the very least, and probably causing a lot more damage, not to mention the risk to my own life. I couldn't cut the rope because I didn't have the reach. Then I remembered what I did have: a small tool kit and a roll of duct tape in the pocket behind my seat. I thought about what I could use those to do, and it occurred to me that the empty second seat behind me also had a metal tube control stick. Well, it would be worth a shot. I controlled the plane with my knees while I reached behind my seat to get the toolkit. Only a single bolt and nut secure the control stick to the tube below, but I had to access it blind, reaching below and behind me while also controlling the plane. After a couple of guesses as to which size socket to put on the ratchet, I had a good grab and managed to get the nut off and extract the screw. A brisk pull-up dislodged the control stick. It was working. The stick was a couple feet long, and I figured it would be enough to reach out the window and down to the rope. Still flying with my knees, I stuck the steak knife handle into the bottom end of the control stick and wrapped a bunch of duct tape around the joint until I felt it would be secure. It was time to give it a try. I lined back up from my pickup site and reaching as far out the left window as I could. While fighting the slipstream, I could just contact the rope. When I reached my target, I started sawing wildly at the rope, but it sliced through with surprising ease. I felt the plane lurch as the banner dropped back down to earth. I landed the plane and took a few minutes to breathe, thinking about what had just happened and then what to do next. It occurred to me that I could tie a knot in the rope and just pick it up again. And that's what I did. Suffice it to say, I was a bit more careful this time, and everything went as planned. From the ground, the only thing anyone would have noticed is that a banner plane picked up a banner and just stayed in the area for a while, dropped the banner, then picked it up again and headed off. Story 21. The only example I can think of where several people ducked up and passengers didn't notice. A friend of mine took the wrong airplane. The aircraft was parked, fueled, and boarded correctly, but it was the wrong tail number. He actually did have an aha moment taxiing out, so he called dispatch and requested an amended release for the tail he was about to fly. But then he took off before receiving the amended release, so that got him a review board. He had screwed up a few other things recently, too, regarding international paperwork, so he was downgraded to the right seat for a time. Passengers didn't know. It could have been my story, but every time I sat down in the banana pit, I checked the tail number versus the release. In one case, where there was a mismatch, the passengers did notice because the aircraft were swapped at the gate, causing a delay. Story 22. Passenger here. There was once when I was little, we landed and the pilots told us to put down our window shades to keep the plane cool. They were pretty insistent. Being a kid, I kept it open a bit to peek out and saw after a little while that we were taxiing backwards. I don't know what happened, but I think they didn't want us to know they made a wrong turn or something. Oops. Story 23. From a commercial pilot's perspective, I'm very sorry to say there aren't a whole lot of "we're all ducked" moments. It's a really safe industry. Minus the odd accidents, such as the tragic 737 MAX events recently, the vast majority of days are quite vanilla. We take off, fly a bit, drink some coffee, then land. Rinse and repeat. That's not to say things don't happen. Minor stuff happens regularly. Small stuff. Not too long ago, I was operating a really early morning sector. First of the day, ground crew asked to remove the ground power. Gave them the thumbs up, only to realize a fraction too late, our OPU wasn't on, plunging an aircraft and a few hundred people into complete darkness. That's awkward as hell, making a PA apologizing for that mistake. Or flying along, looking out the window, master caution starts flashing at us. Door 1L open. Crap. Check cabin pressure. It's all good. Call cabin crew. Door is still in place. As usual, the micro switch which indicated door position to the aircraft had failed. There is an insane amount of force holding the doors shut. It's impossible for them to open in the air, but crafty switches do fail. We follow procedures. Safety is maintained. Or TCAs. Traffic Collision Avoidance System, the name explains its purpose. Events, when aircraft get a bit too close to each other. Not common in my part of the world due to the superb air traffic controllers, but it does happen every now and then. Or unwell passengers, diverting due to people being seriously ill, life-threatening. The words "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday" really does open the skies for you. It's quite a fascinating process to watch, one I'd love to be a fly on the wall for. Wind shear, turbulence, general crafty weather. I remember when I started the job, I used to be so keen on what the weather was doing. Now we just turn up and brief it an hour before we fly. Bad weather? Tough, we're going. I've had turbulence so bad that even as a pilot I've felt quite uncomfortable, dropping 100 feet in a split second, speed varying by 40 k's on final approach, etc. Or when you cross a continent to find a forecast storm sitting over the runway and you've not got a huge amount of fuel left to make a decision. You can't press pause ever. Every second you waste in these situations is fuel being burnt out the back of the engines. Other amusing ones. In Spain, I once had to abort my landing and execute a missed approach due to a dog being on the runway. Passengers get a little unnerved by it, but it's all very normal to us. Took them a while to move the dog on. I hope they were nice to it. As I say, the industry is incredibly safe. We're not punished for mistakes. They are used as learning points. This encourages continued development from all parties, and in turn it has turned the most unnatural thing for humans to do into an everyday occurrence. Small stuff happens all the time, but rarely is it a major safety concern. This extends to the mechanical side too. Planes are so well designed and manufactured these days that I have absolute confidence in my aircraft. People often ask me if I worry about flying. Do I ever get scared? My simple answer is no. If I did, I'd be a bit rubbish at my job, considering I fly up to 20 times a week. Story 24. I know this doesn't fit this thread at all, but I've been wanting to share this for years. It's actually quite the opposite in a lot of ways, but I'm telling it. I was at work one day, and this guy, known for telling great tales, calls a girl at my work as he's leaving SSSW. He tells her his plane might be going down. It spreads like wildfire throughout the company, and I hear about it. So naturally think, yeah, right, and bring up his flight on FlightAware to see a really messed up flight pattern. Anyway, his story went like this. They're just taking off, and the right engine disintegrates. The captain comes on and says what happened, and that they need to dump fuel and try to land. The try part comes from the fact they're not sure if the engine took out the landing gear. At this point, everyone is panicking, and even the flight attendants are crying and freaking out. The captain comes back on and says to assume crash positions, which is basically putting your head down and kissing your ass goodbye. They land and all is good. What I saw on FlightAware was a plane take off and circle like 8 times, then land. I couldn't imagine that and think about it every time I take off in a plane. The chaos and feelings my friend and everyone else must have felt must have been intense. It never made it on the news. It never was reported, which only makes you wonder how often does stuff like that happen. Story 25. Not a pilot, but a flight attendant. We landed. Everything went smoothly as we're deplaning. The pilot steps out of the flight deck and goes, "Wow, I'm glad we made it. We lost 2 hydraulics on the way down." Story 26. I'm so late to the part, but I've been looking for an explanation from a pilot to the experience I had on an Embraer 145J from Newark to Albany one afternoon. I've been on a lot of flights, especially that little hop, many times. I know what the normal sounds are, including when it sounds like the engine's cut out and it feels like some hit the brakes. This was different. We took off like normal, but about a minute into the climb, the plane went dead silent and we went into an abrupt nosedive for 5 seconds, which felt like eternity. At least 7 people screamed. I clutched my armrest and made peace with that fact that this was finally happening. I always knew I would die in a plane crash. Miraculously, the engine suddenly kicked back in and we went right back into a sharp climb. 5 seconds after, the exact same thing happened to us again. The plane's engines went silent, and we were pointing hard back at the earth. More people screamed this time, and it was louder than the first time. Again, the engines turned on, and we got up to cruising altitude, but the whole flight was shaky. It felt slow. It really felt like we were about to drop out of the sky. There was a woman from Long Island in front of me, nervously talking to everybody, saying things like, "My Mutha would say he's acting like a hot shot." We landed in Albany with no explanation as to what happened. Most pilots I've ever asked shake their head in confusion, unsure what could have happened. One explanation was that there's a mandatory noise abatement protocol over certain neighborhoods in Newark. Oftentimes, they'll get clearance to not back the engines off. Possibly in this case, the pilot thought he would get the clearance. Air traffic peeps said no and made the pilot back off and drop back down to a certain altitude. And they did that in the worst way possible for non-pilot passengers. This sounds like bullcrap to me, but it's all I have. This experience traumatized me a little bit, so a real explanation would be great. Story 27. I was by myself, but there was a lot of people in the sailboats below me that I would have crashed into if I hadn't recovered. My dad ran the FBO at this little coastal airport. I worked for him and learned to fly on my off time. I had about 20 solo hours under my belt and was flying one gorgeous hot summer afternoon to do some touch and goes. I take off and had just passed over the power lines at the end of the runway. It's so hot that the plane is basically hanging in the air, slowly ascending in the humid soup of that scorching afternoon. Everyone who can be on the water in the harbor is desperate to find some relief. I'm checking off my list of potential hazards. Cleared the power lines. Next is the sailboat basin. Then the crowded resort town until I can dogleg off to the national seashore and away from civilization. When it happens, entire firewall instrument panel falls off into my lap. The 172 had just been taken in for maintenance, and the new guy didn't screw the panel back into place. I'm strong for an 18-year-old girl and don't panic much. It still took all my strength to keep the yoke steady as I adjust to the roar and heat of the engine. With my free hand, I reach out and grab the hole that the yoke protrudes out of and pull up. I manage to shimmy the panel back in place and keep it in place with my hand and knee. It does cut into my knee, but I manage to ignore it long enough to call over the radio and say, "I have a minor problem and need to be next to land." The airport was unmanned, but the local pilots are a congenial bunch and will radio their position if requested. So the other pilots get out of my way and let me land. Of course, my dad and anyone who was on the ground and in the FBO and heard me was standing by the maintenance hangar to see what happened. They couldn't believe that I managed to not crash. Those panels are heavy metal. The new maintenance guy was already not passing muster with our regular guy, so he was fired. I was close with the main mechanic, and he was so upset that he hadn't double-checked the panel. But it's an instrument panel, which should have obviously been manageable for even a trained monkey. I'm forever grateful for my awesome instructors who drilled emergency preparation into me. My favorite was the older brother of Michael J. Smith, the pilot of the Challenger. When I had to quit flying because of a heart problem, on my last flight before I went back to school, he took me barnstorming over a friend's property. He was having me set up an emergency landing on the field and told me that we were going to get down to about 50 feet. Then he slams the throttle to the wall and says, "Surprise! We did a few more flyovers. Best flight ever." Story 28. When I was learning to fly, there is a stage in your student license where you are awarded GFPT, General Flying Purpose Test. This allows the student to fly by themselves or with passengers to the local training area from the aerodrome. So there I am, 16 years old, pimple-faced, no life experience at all, thinking I the king crap. I was practicing engine failures in a Piper Tomahawk. This is where you are start at 3,000 feet. You retard the throttle back to idle and go through a series of steps deciding which field to land in. I go through the process and I met a nice approach to land in some farmer's field when I decide to go around. I apply full throttle at 500 feet to end the exercise, and my chair slides fully aft off the rails. I cannot reach the yoke nor any controls. It was discovered later that the stops that would have prevented the chair from falling off the rails were not installed. If I had set my chair correctly to begin with, So there I am sitting in a descending aircraft with no control on my own. I'm desperately wrestling with my seatbelt. The clutch mechanism of the seatbelt is doing the trick where it is tightening every time I try to slowly pull at it. On each attempt, it tightens further. I am now firmly up against the seat back of the chair. I am now 100 feet to the ground when I remembered about my trim. Next to me, between the seat, is a wheel that is used to trim the aircraft in different profiles. I spin this wheel faster than any DJ has ever done so before. The yoke slowly retreats from the console dash. I grab it, arms outstretched, and then complete the go-around. I'm now so close to the ground, I can see the reverse cowlick of a grazing cow below me. I climbed slowly back up to the top of the training area and flew back to the aerodrome straight away. I can honestly say that I lost my teenager banana-ness from that incident. I have another student pilot incident to add if anyone is interested to hear it, though. I like flying planes when I can reach the controls, not so much when I can't. Story 29. Obligatory, not an airline pilot, but I am a private pilot and know a handful of airline pilots. Most of the things that make you feel like you're going to crash in a large jet turboprop are really not significant. Planes can handle way more turbulence than you fly through. That sound is probably normal, and the engine quitting doesn't mean you're going to fall out of the sky. Go-arounds, where the plane aborts its landing, happen a handful of times a day at most airports. It's nothing out of the ordinary. Flying on a U.S. airline is one of the safest things you can do. You're more likely to die driving to the airport, or even falling out of bed, than you are in a large commercial airliner crash. Also, tarmac isn't any part of an airport, but rather a material that was used to make airport surfaces decades ago. Runway is where you land, take off. Taxiway is where planes are moving and speaking with air traffic control. Ramp, apron, is where planes are parked and pushed back. Story 30. Ex-Navy guy. I was a front-seater, navigator, in the E-6B Prowler on an Operation New Dawn, O&D mission, in the late stages of the Iraq withdrawal. My pilot and I had been covering extra missions for dudes on our boat who couldn't fly due to a gastrointestinal outbreak on our ship. Legit. A third of the ship's complement of 5K people was crapting itself uncontrollably since someone couldn't wash their hands before handling the corn dogs and iceberg lettuce. This is disturbingly common. We were exhausted with the uptick in tempo that came from covering their duties. It was one night when we were flying out of Iraq and back to the boat at roughly midnight. I was drifting, but doing everything I could to stay awake. Talking, turning up my oxygen, and even ducking slapping myself. For some reason, I gave in. I don't know why. Then I wake up in a panic and realize our ship's AC control, Strike, was contacting us on guard, emergency channel. Embarrassed that I missed a whole other call on another channel, and even more mortified that I fell asleep in front of my pilot, I rogered up and set the new nav. Then I realized the pilot was asleep too. I got on ICS, crew comms, to talk to the guys in back. No answers, likely also asleep. I patted the pilot on the leg, woke him up, pretended I didn't think he was asleep to help him save face. I fed him a Monster Energy drink and kept calling him awesome like a good NFO does. And we brought it in for an OK 3-wire. God, he was sweating like an idiot. But he was one of the best, skeeziest pilots I knew. He could play off a mistake like he was adding an extra challenge to his portfolio. Definitely missed those days. So yeah, he and I knew the guys in back were clueless, and we ate a duck ton of ice cream that night, happy just to be alive. Story 31. Late to the party, but I've actually had a few of these moments. I was flying late at night. One of my planes is a small 6-seat propeller aircraft, a 36. I was flying a group of people from Nantucket to Cape Cod. About halfway at cruising altitude, several of the passengers wanted to do a 360-degree turn to get a good view of the stars. Not only was it a cloudless night, but it was also a night of a new moon, so there was zero light pollution. The stars were incredible, and even the Milky Way galaxy was very visible. And being up at altitude, we had a 369-degree non-obstructed view. Even as a pilot, it was one of the most impressive viewings I've had. I reduced my power and started a very low banked slow turn. As I'm enjoying the view, the engine went from running nice and smooth to shaking the aircraft instantly. Immediately, I knew something was wrong with one of the cylinders. After inspecting my engine instruments and playing with the power and mixture settings, I was able to determine that I still had detonation, but one of my valves were probably failing. My destination airport was the closest airport as we were in the middle of Nantucket Sound. I continued there at a higher than normal power setting because it seemed like it was forcing the failed valve to still open with the extra power. I kept my altitude until I knew I could make the airport and then went idle and glided all the way in. Although I was glued to my instruments, none of the passengers expected anything or even noticed the sudden change of the engine mid-flight. Although the sound of the engine was questioned when we were on the ground, which I had explained everything. This unfortunately led to around $13K worth of engine work, but she's up and running now in tip-top shape. Sorry on mobile. Story 32. February 2017, flying American Airlines from Miami to Bomb. We boarded the plane and noticed it was very hot. The air wasn't working. The attendant said it was, but the air blowing out of the vents was hot AF. Anyway, we were about 45 minutes out in the flight. We're all burning up and sweating our asses off. Pilot comes over the speaker, says that we are headed back to Miami and not to worry, but we've lost cabin pressure. Like I said, we were 45 minutes out from Miami, but it only took us like 20 minutes tops to get back to Miami. I knew crap was serious, with the attendant was buckling herself in as soon as the pilot made the announcement. It was so hot and hard to breathe. What was even scarier is watching your plane pass the airport to fly over the ocean and dump fuel. I'm assuming that's just in case we land badly, less chance of exploding. When it came time to land, we were directed to a clear section of the airport. You could see emergency crews lining the tarmac like they were just waiting to recover bodies. It was the worst landing of my life. I swear to go, we came in so hot we were on 2 wheels for a few secs. A friend of mine on the trip with me had never flown before and was damn near in cardiac arrest. I was just dumbfounded any of this was happening. Anyway, they let us off directly on the tarmac as quickly as possibly. We had to wait 2 hours for a different plane. American Airlines offered us all free beer to make up for the scare, though. Then we had to wait an additional hour because our stewardess had gotten so freaked out she grabbed her wheeled bag and went the duck home. Story 33. Helicopter pilot here. I was flying a relatively short tour with 3 passengers and in 44 reels over some vineyards near the airport I was flying out of. Passengers were all pretty cool and relaxed through the flight, so naturally I was as well. Person up front with me was very interested in what I was doing and how everything worked. He had a million questions and I was happy to answer them all. Anyways, tour's almost over and I'm on about 1/2 mile final when the clutch light turns on. For those not familiar, the clutch light on Robinson helicopters is pretty normal and comes on whenever the clutch is adjusting. Especially in colder climates, it is completely normal to come on for a few seconds and go away. No big deal. However, if it stays on for more than 10 seconds, we're potentially in big trouble. So the clutch light comes on while I'm mid-sentence, and I subconsciously start counting. Somewhere around 7, I stop talking. Flip the pilot ISO, practically in denial that this is about to happen. I get to 10, pull the clutch circuit breaker. At the same time, I felt just the slightest tail shudder, so I pushed for some extra airspeed and mentally prepared to do an auto, power off landing. Luckily, we made it to the ground fine and I never lost power. After I set it down, the person up front looked at me and says, "What was that all about?" So I just said, "I thought you guys would enjoy a little excitement at the end." They thought it was awesome, so I sent them on their merry way, none the wiser. After they walked away, I opened it up to see only one of the 4 clutch belts still in place. Scariest day that those folks will never know they had, haha. Story 34. I wasn't the pilot in the story, I was the clueless passenger. My cousin was a pilot, small craft like crop dusters and helicopters. He was probably a pretty competent pilot. Spent a lot of time flying bad forest fires, running power lines, flying geologists on erupting volcanoes, removing shot-up soldiers from across enemy lines while being shot at, etc. One time, he took me up in his crop duster. It was a little single-seater. I was sitting on the empty chemical tub behind his seat. We were flying over a little town, not sure how high, but not very high, perhaps a couple thousand feet. I was leaning way over trying to get a look out the window when he started to look way left and way right, like he was trying to see the tail end of the plane. He was methodically checking various controls, and also appeared to be methodically messing with the little mechanical trim controls. Finally, he looked back along the inside of the cabin, just under the window, and when he got to where I was leaning out the window, he asked me to move away from the window a bit. After we landed, he pointed out the little rudder, if I recall correctly, control wire that I'd been leaning on pretty hard. He said that he'd been fairly sure that there was a control failure of some kind, and that he thought we'd possibly be landing fairly hard in a not optimal place to land. Dude was unshakable. Story 35. If anyone sees this, here goes. Work at a few airports for my job and fly a lot. I've got a couple. First, there was a flight I was on, Cheer J700, and the pilot gets on and tells us that in about 15 minutes we may experience some turbulence. Captain here. In about 15 minutes we may hit something, and it may get a little rough. Some planes in front of us have experienced some bad chop, and it may be pretty dicey. We are going to keep the drinks going, but I'll put the seatbelts on in about 10 minutes. So, yeah, we all looked around like WTF. Well, we hit what he was talking about, and it was violent. Smacked this air pocket hard, went up and then pointed at a steep angle down, went weightless, then the pilot righted the plane. After we land, they had to ground the plane to inspect it. Pretty sure we experienced some hefty G's for commercial air travel. The second is one related to my job. Happened at an airport I worked on a while back. A citation, hit a couple large birds, lost one engine, and damaged the other. They came in on emergency landing. The one good engine was smoking during landing. Passengers get off and go into the FBO for drinks and stuff, joking on the way in. I get a chance to talk to the pilot for information on the strike. He was visibly upset, was surprised that they made in for landing. Both engines super ducked, and we were surprised the one kept running as much as it did. Story 36. T-38C instructor pilot here. For everyone who isn't familiar, all USAF pilots who fly fast, pointy airplanes go through training in the T-38C. It's a pretty old jet, flown since 1970, that is notorious for being underpowered with very tiny wings. Many a pilot have died during actual TP stalls in what we call the final turn, the 180-degree turn from downwind to final that military aircraft make in a single descending, relatively tight turn anyways. My student is extremely close to the runway on downwind, literally half as far from the runway as he's supposed to be laterally. And because I'm relatively comfortable in the moment, I don't tell him to discontinue his approach, break out, and re-enter the pattern to try again. Definitely a foul on me. So he rolls off into his final turn, and I immediately assess that the turn is going to be too tight and that we're going to stall. I take control and start a go-around, immediately selecting maximum afterburner and pulling as tightly as possible. We're going relatively slow, so we're limited by the aircraft's AOA available, not GEs. I'm pulling a maximum AOA turn, trying not to overshoot the runway. This is important because we have a parallel runway that is occupied by other aircraft in their own VFR pattern. We still overshoot like big dogs, but we end up not stalling and successfully completing the turn. I deconfigure and take a few seconds to calm down. My student had absolutely no awareness of the significance of what had just occurred. Suffice to say, he had quite the debrief. Story 37. I was a C-141 navigator for my first AF assignment. We were flying a group of families moving back to the US from Japan. As we were in the approach at Travis Air Force Base, we had a massive multi-bird strike. It sounded like the world was ending inside the banana pit. It was so loud. Shattered glass that was coated in red liquid and feathers, bent radome, you name it. Flight controls were fine, but we declared an IFE, and the co-pilot could see well enough out his window to land, and I and the FE were over his shoulder to help spot however we could, and we landed without incident. The passengers deplaned and even complimented us on the great flight. I will never forget the right side of the passenger bus driving away and the look of horror on those people's faces when they saw what the front of that airplane looked like. Story 38. In January 2007, I was on the passenger manifest for a flight from Mosul, Iraq, Camp Diamondback, to Tal Afar. The flight was scheduled to leave at 0100. I arrived at just after midnight, and it was raining and pretty windy. About 15 minutes before the flight was supposed to leave, we were told the flight was canceled due to the weather. Since I was stationed at Diamondback, I just went back to my bunk and hit the hay because I was told we would be flying out at 0600 instead. The passenger gathering point, APAX, was right next to the hospital, and as I walked through the hospital on my way to the flight line, a friend of mine came running up to me and threw her arms around my neck, hugged me, and started crying. It turns out the pilots changed their mind about flying, and the U-60 Blackhawks left at 0130. The helicopter had crashed just outside Tal Afar, was still missing at that point, and my name was still on the manifest. We found out a few hours later that there were no survivors of the crash. It was a spooky ducking feeling. I had to email my family and let them know if anyone showed up to notify them. I had been Kia, that it was a mistake. I don't know if this belongs under this heading, but it's definitely the scariest flight-related event of my life. Story 39. In 1994, while lining up for final approach to George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston on a sunny and humid 100 degrees of day, our Boeing 747 hit a large downburst and suddenly dropped 1,000 feet in altitude without warning. All of the passengers were seatbelted in and were completing their U.S. Customs declaration cards. The flight attendants were walking the aisles making sure that the passengers and aircraft were ready for landing. The sudden drop caused the flight attendants to hit the ceiling. Fortunately, none of them were injured, but the aircraft definitely experienced negative G-forces for a few seconds. Story 40. Yay, story time. I'm an air traffic controller, for the record. Had a pilot go Nordo. That's when, for whatever reason, they aren't on my frequency anymore. They didn't get the right one, misheard, or their radios crapped out. It happens fairly often, and there are a number of things we can do to get you back in the right place. This particular guy, however, went Nordo at precisely the worst time. He was going eastbound, which means he was at an odd altitude. He lost his radio, and his flight plan then had him turn southbound. That means he was supposed to be at an even altitude, which he obviously wasn't. There were about a dozen different planes going northbound that were at his altitude. So he ended up running one heck of a gauntlet through all these people as I was descending and climbing them to get them out of his way. Then, apparently in an act of sheer ignorance on the pilot's part, he decided to choose an even altitude all by himself, knowing he should probably be at 1. Remember all those planes I had to move out of his way? He managed to put himself right back into them. When you have closure rates of over 1,000 knots, that's not a lot of time to react to those things. At the end, my asshole was clenched so tight that when I stood up, the seat came with me. Story 41. Not a pilot, but was an air traffic controller. I have a million ducked-up pilot stories, though. One somewhat amusing stories, yet also very sad, was a pilot who flew in on emergency fuel in his MiG. He flew around to air shows. He was erratic and didn't listen to instructions well, but landed safely. He left my airport a few days later. He went down in the mountains and was never found. The finding was likely low fuel due to scraping his fuel tanks at an air show prior to arriving at my airport. He never even had it looked at while he was at my airport. He was aware he had SCD his fuel tanks. He came into my airport emergency fuel, yet pressed on. This is seriously one of the million, huh? Pilot stories I have. They're just people. They're flawed like the rest of us. Story 42. Helicopter pilot here. No passengers per se, but 2 pilots and an air crewman in the back. We were at a civilian airport working their runway at nighttime on night vision goggles. On takeoff, there was a lot of chatter on our second radio, so we turned it all the way down. It was just our base and maintenance frequency, and none of it pertained to us. We were just concerned with our primary radio, ground, tower, working area frequencies. Later in the flight, as we approached the civilian airport, we changed our second radio from our base frequency to the civilian traffic frequency. It was night, so the only traffic is usually other military training flights, so we weren't too worried about other aircraft. Alas, we made all the standard calls. After about 3 laps in the pattern, we stopped making calls because we knew we were the only traffic. About 15 minutes later, as we turned onto final, we came right over top of another helicopter. I pulled in power and climbed away. We realized that we had left our radio volume down and didn't hear the other aircraft coming in. We had taken a few laps off from making radio calls, and we were out of phase in the pattern and didn't see the other aircraft. Scared me crapless coming right over top of another helicopter's main rotors. Story 43. About 15 years ago, I was a passenger on a flight that started having bad turbulence. The flight attendants were serving drinks, so they locked up their carts as the pilot told them to sit down. A minute into it, I realized we were also descending very rapidly. I caught a glimpse of the 2 flight attendants holding hands, and I thought, wow, even they are scared. And it really unsettled me. A minute later, and we were still bumping around and descending fast, everyone starts gasping and a few people yell, "Drinks are flying everywhere." I don't know why I had just assumed that if we were all about to die, that the pilot would make an announcement, and then I realized that they probably wouldn't say anything to keep everyone calm. I look at the flight attendants again, and they are both sobbing, holding on to each other. I was pretty sure that if they knew we were about to die, obviously we all survived, and I have no clue what was going on or if we were ever in real danger. But now I search the flight attendants' faces whenever there's any tiny bit of turbulence. Story 44. Before I start, I'm French, so I made some mistakes. So I was co-pilot in a Boeing 737-800. We were on short final at Gatwick in TL, England. Flaps 30 degrees, spoilers or air brakes, armed, auto brakes set. Everything was fine until this happened. Me and my captain hear the GPWs, a voice in the banana pit to help pilots, saying, "Too low, flaps." We too were scared from the voice. The captain put a hard pressure on the yoke, that thing used to control the plane, which gives me the priority to fly the plane. But when the priority changed, I was putting flaps lower. The nose got down. When I noticed the plane going down, I immediately grabbed the yoke and pulled the nose up. But the plane was at 400 feet above the ground. Then my captain says, "Cap equal sign. Captain me equal sign me. Cap, we might not make it. We're gonna stall." Me. What? Engage the 2 gear. Auto takeoff / go around. Quick. Cap. Okay. He presses the button and the thrust lever goes up. I say to the captain that we may continue our approach as we're on the right altitude again. He agrees and we land with no problem. The passengers and the FAs didn't notice anything, and we landed smoothly. Clearly buttery. Story 45. Not a pilot. Coming in from Lax to Dallas. Rough ride, bad storm. The captain comes on and says we will probably have to divert. But he wants to try something, and we should all buckle up for the fun of it. We dropped what felt like a couple hundred feet, and a crosswind took our left wing up. The whole plane starts screaming, and you can feel the plane moving sideways. About 50 feet from the runway, and we literally slide to the next runway over and hit the deck at full speed. Slam on the brakes, the whole plane lurches and buckles. Pilot comes on the comm. "Woo, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dallas-Fort Worth. And if you could not tell my bosses, I just did that, I would appreciate it oh so very much. Please, remain seated." Story 46. Not a pilot, and late to the game here, but on December 1st, 1974, I was a passenger on a flight from Chicago to Washington National. The weather coming in was not good. Like other flights, we were probably routed to Dulles because National was closed due to weather. So was TWA 514, which slammed into a mountain ahead of us. That resulted in Dulles shutting down, leaving us, and presumably other flights circling over Washington. Circling for a very long time, fuel running low. We must have been the last flight cleared to land at Baltimore. We landed, and the plane came to a stop at the end of the runway. The pilot came out and shook everyone's hands to applause. We deplaned right there at the end of the runway and were shuttled to the terminal. I can only guess that we landed without fuel and the plane had to be towed in. I was 5, and that's how I remember it. Story 47. Answering for my dad, now a 747 captain for British Airways, as he isn't on Reddit. He was SFO on a flight that had a terrorist attack attempt. A man broke into the banana pit, pulled the captain away from the controls, and grabbed them, pointing the nose straight down, trying to crash the plane directly into the ground. The captain, who was a Scottish man, said in an interview, in his strong Glaswegian accent, I could see the only way to stop him was to seriously hurt him. So I did. He stuck his damn thumbs into the eyes of the guy trying to take over the plane. He and my dad safely landed, and the guy was arrested. They each got a bottle of Glenmorangie as a reward. Story 48. Passenger here. When the DC-9 we were on did a 180 on the runway during landing was pretty bad. Doing 100 miles per hour going backwards down a runway I think qualifies as a we're all ducked moment. Hydroplaning a passenger jet is bad. The pilot stopped the plane by putting forward thrusters in. This was in the 70s. My parents got free drinks at the bar, and the pilots lost their licenses. Later, the runway was found to be subpar. Story 49. One time, during glider training, I left my water bottle in the leather boot at the base of the control stick. I didn't notice it until we were accelerating down the runway behind the tow plane. Luckily, it only restricted the large movements required during the first few seconds of the takeoff run, but I could still feel it binding up until I managed to reach down and grab it after reaching a safe altitude. The instructor wasn't aware of the situation, but scalded me when he saw that I'd brought the bottle with me, saying, "Loose objects in the banana pit can be very dangerous." I didn't have the balls to tell him about it during the debrief. Story 50. Once in 2013, my plane failed to start engine at the alternative airport, and I has to spend 2 more days in a poor hotel with all my 158 passengers waiting repair parts. I thought they would kill me every time I meet any one of them those days. Story 51. I'm glad OP clarified they were directing the question only to airline pilots of Reddit who survived their ducked up moment. Definitely don't want this thread infested with creepy responses from spooky ghost pilots of Reddit. Story 52. My best friend's dad was a pilot for Western and Delta for a lot of years. He's always said that the most terrifying thing he experienced was flying into Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong. Due to the terrain and high rises at one end of the runway, you had a pretty sharp right turn on final approach, and it took you close enough to the high rises that you could see TVS in the apartments. Story 53. Private pilot here. Cessna 172 doing a touch and go, but landed with the wind at my back instead of my nose. When I added throttle and pitched up, the wind gusted and killed my lift. I didn't ascend hardly at all. Put on some flaps and managed to get above the fence I almost hit.